Attention, school-based dyslexia educators.
Are you tired of juggling prep work and paper materials?
Amplio Reading Intervention is here to give you more time for what matters most, your students.
Amplio offers fully digitized versions of the renowned MTA and Esperanza curricula, making it easier than ever to deliver structured literacy intervention and track progress in real time, all while staying aligned with Texas Dyslexia Handbook standards.
Come join countless districts who are simplifying their dyslexia interventions with Amplio.
Learn more at ampliolearning.com. That's AMPLIO learning.com. Because empowering students starts with empowering educators.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So I just want to kind of talk about the IDA National Conference is coming up this week, just in time for Dyslexia Awareness Month, right? And it's going to be in the DFW area.
I'm so excited. This is the 75th anniversary of the International Dyslexia Association annual conference, and we're going to be there.
Yes, we're going to be man on the street.
Woo! You got to
Interviewing.
stop by and come and see us. We can interview you. We will have special guests. Hopefully, we'll get some of these speakers we've had on our show. Come by and meet us and maybe also appear on the podcast again.
That would be lovely.
That would be lovely. So the great thing about this is if you are in town and you want to stop by, the exhibition hall is open to the public. You can stop by October 24th through 26th, and it's at the Hyatt Regency in Dallas.
Okay, very good. I'm really looking forward. I'm actually kind of excited about this.
Oh, me too. We are going to have so much fun. We have a cute little banner. We have T-shirts. We're going to have swag for people that stop by.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you guys are going to have
We've
fun
been
if you
working
stop
on
by.
this for a while. Yeah. So excited. And so we really hope if you're there and you listen to our podcast, come up to the table and say, hey, love your podcast, and take a picture with us and we'll put it on our social media.
Yes.
So come by and see us and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yes. Come join us.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, this is Amy.
And Melissa. We are a couple of retired Texas teachers who are CALTs, Certified Academic Language Therapists. We started our own businesses, and now we have a podcast called The Dyslexia Duo.
So join us for our informative podcast where we'll delve into dyslexia, covering the topics that affect parents, therapists, teachers, practitioners, and anyone who wants to learn more. We'll guide you through everything you need to know, from the first signs to the intricacies of dyslexia curriculum placement and beyond.
This season, we will cover the referral process, what to expect when your child or student is dyslexic, the generational impacts of dyslexia, and how to support those affected.
Come join us. Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So on today's episode, we talked to Natalie Wexler. Now, you may know her from her book, The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It, which that would be great. Also, she wrote The Writing Revolution with Judith Hochman and the updated Writing Revolution 2.0. So definitely check those out. But Natalie Wexler is an educational journalist who wrote for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, and other publications. And she's a senior contributor to Forbes.com and the co-author of those books I just talked about. So she's a freelance writer and essayist on a variety of topics, as well as a lawyer and a legal historian.
What I hope that the listeners get from this, I'm super excited about, is how background knowledge plays a part in comprehension. Vocabulary, how very important that is. And she's got so many good tips and tricks for educators.
Oh, absolutely. And I love how she talks about using nonfiction, not just for reading background knowledge and reading comprehension, but even to pull it into your writing at times too.
Oh, yes. And she said that writing is crucial to our students being able to learn.
And I don't know about you, but I'm not really great about pulling in I'm lucky if I get to spelling half the time.
I know I need to work on it. So I learned a thing or two about
yes,
that.
it's super important. So here she is. This is Natalie Wexler with the Dyslexia Duo. This is Amy.
And Melissa.
And we're the
Dyslexia Duo.
So today we have a very special guest. We have on here Natalie Wexler, and she has written a few books. I don't know why I'm holding it up. It's a podcast. The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. Wonderful information. And she's co-author of The Writing Revolution. So we'd like to welcome you to our little podcast. It's growing in popularity. So we have a wide audience. We have parents, we have educators, we have dyslexia personnel, we have administrators. It's quite a wide variety of people. But if you would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure, be happy to. And thanks for having me on. So I'm Natalie Wexler. I'm an education writer. I've done a number of things, but for the last maybe 12 years or so, I've been writing about education, the 3 books if you count 2.0 that you mentioned. I also have a free Substack newsletter called Minding the Gap, and people can find more information about me and all of those things on my website, which is nataliewexler.com.
Yeah, I was reading over that. Before we interview anybody, I tried to read as much as possible, so I sound mildly informed as to what I'm talking about. But it's a wonderful, oh my gosh, so much information you have on there, and it's just wonderful to keep up with. The low-hanging fruit for so many of us, especially at the early grade levels, is phonological awareness and decoding and fluency. We can do that. It's the whole morphology, comprehension, grammar, writing. That's the one that I feel like I struggle. And if I've been doing this since 92, if I'm struggling in that area, I don't feel as strong as it in other areas. I can imagine that others feel the same way.
I struggle with that too, Amy. I feel like a lot of it is a lack of assessment on my part for not knowing how to assess for what writing needs to be taught or what skills of the writing process need to be taught in order to get started with the proper instruction. So I'm hoping that we get great tips and our listeners get great tips too, which I know they will because you are so phenomenal, Miss Wexler. And also I wanted to point out that I will put this link, nataliewexler.com, on our Facebook page too. So anybody listening can go check there.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's go ahead and start with our first question. Kind of start with like a prelude to it. So comprehension is a hot topic among teachers of all grade levels. And for many K through 2 teachers, like we said, they understand PA, decoding, and fluency, but we really seem to be at a standstill with comprehension. I mean, and I get to the comprehension part of my lesson and we can talk about the characters and the setting and the main idea and we infer. The inference is really hard. Summarization is really hard, even really finding the topic sentence main idea. But I want to go a little beyond that. First of all, how can we teach students to understand what they read, especially at the secondary level where it is so important that they understand what they are reading?
Well, I think we first of all have to recognize that comprehension is way more complex than decoding, phonemic awareness. It is not just a set of abstract skills that you can teach directly and then students will be able to apply them generally to anything they read. If you can find the main idea of a text on a, like a very simple story, doesn't mean you're going to be able to find the main idea if it's a text that uses pretty complex sentence structure and vocabulary and it's on a topic that you don't know anything about. That's a completely different ballgame, right? So we have to think of comprehension as a process. And so it is not that you never could ask students, can you find the main idea? Or, it's a question of what you put in the foreground. And what we need to do is put the content, the particular text or topic in the foreground and bring in whatever skills or strategies are appropriate to help students understand that particular text. And eventually, as students acquire, I would say, a critical mass of sort of knowledge of a lot of different topics, and through that knowledge of a a certain amount of academic vocabulary, and I'd like to talk about this too, familiarity with complex sentence structure, which, we use sentence structures in written text that we do not use in conversation. All of those things will eventually come together to give them a better general reading comprehension ability. But the only way to get to that general ability is through teaching kids about a lot of specific topics, ideally in a sort of logical, coherent order. So by the time kids get to sixth grade, they will have acquired the background knowledge they need to understand at sixth grade through the curriculum. They will have acquired the knowledge that's assumed by the sixth grade curriculum, and so on. Awesome. So that's the way we need to reconceptualize comprehension, not as something that's just related to reading. It is really related to everything we are able to learn. And it is also a way of learning. So it is not that it's sort of this separate sphere with reading over here and content subjects on the other side. It's all connected.
No, and I think that's perfect. And that kind of just led right into my second part of that question is, what is the importance of reading comprehension in nonfiction text? I remember when I was getting my master's, because it's so easy for students to make that personal connection with fiction text, right? Because that's text to self piece that they're making that relationship with. But I had a professor when I was getting my master's say, you need to pull in more nonfiction, because when you grow up, that's more of what you're reading in your adult life, like manuals and biographies and things that you need in your day-to-day. So talking about things like social studies or history or even pulling in science, what is the importance of reading comprehension in pulling in nonfiction text?
Yeah, obviously fiction, poetry have their place in the classroom, elementary, K through 12, but we do have some evidence suggesting that it's those social studies and science topics that do the most to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary that's going to be assumed by more complex text. And so we need to start building that kind of knowledge in kindergarten, because we're going to be planting the seeds of later success. You can't just focus on the vocabulary that kids can actually read in the books they can read now, that they can decode themselves. You have to, put into their long-term memory more sophisticated information and vocabulary. And the best way to do that is through read-alouds from text and discussion. And then nonfiction does, generally speaking, assume more knowledge and vocabulary than a lot of fiction does. And I'd say the other thing that distinguishes nonfiction often, not always, but often from fiction, is that it's not presented as a narrative. And that can be more challenging to understand. We have evidence that the human mind is sort of hardwired to take in information more easily when it's presented in the form of a narrative. Yeah. And that means that you might want to introduce maybe, a new science topic with some kind of narrative, because it's going to be easier for kids to take in that new information that way. Maybe a biography of a scientist, maybe some other kind of, it doesn't have to be fiction. Anything that has sort of a storyline and conflict and characters, that's a narrative. But then once kids have some familiarity with the basic topic, then they should be reading some expository text, because they are going to need to be able to do that, as you mentioned, throughout life. And we're not just talking here about the ability to do well in high school or college. It's also, these are life skills, being able to read a lease agreement or, insurance forms, whatever. We have a lot of adults out there that are not equipped well to do that.
Yeah. That's absolutely correct. One of the things you had said, you talked about how you form that connection is through read alouds and discussion. And even when I teach teachers how to work in a dyslexia or how to train in a dyslexia curricula. And we'll pull in books from authors like yourself, and they'll have an assigned chapter to read, and then they have to write a summary, but I don't let them just turn it in. We talk about it, because that's how you form that connection, not just from discussing what you read, but hearing somebody else's viewpoint and what they noticed about it.
Yes, and I think that can also help create a sense of community in the classroom, that we really, in the typical literacy classroom, you've got 25 kids going off to read 25 different books because they're all practicing theoretically the same skill, but there's no basis really for interaction. And I think the students that suffer the most from this leveled reading system are the ones who are going to be put in the low reading groups and limited to texts that they at least theoretically can decode and understand themselves. But, when I've spoken to teachers who've switched to it, these whole class read alouds, whole class discussion of fairly complex texts, they tell me it's often those kids who would be in the low reading groups, the kids with IEPs, the English language learners, who make the most insightful contributions to class discussion. And that does wonders, not only for their learning, but for their sense of self-esteem and how their peers perceive them.
I was going to say, that kind of brings them to the forefront of what their peers in their classroom, they're seeing this child, this student, this peer of theirs who maybe isn't performing where everybody else is, but they have all this knowledge on this topic. I think that's an important thing to note. Thank you so much.
So we know that as educators, background knowledge is crucial in developing a well-rounded language experience for children. Well, background knowledge, in my opinion, is one of the difficult things to acquire for children that have a home life that isn't linguistically enriched. As far as you're concerned, how is background knowledge acquired? What are some best things that people can do at home? If this is a parent listening, what are some things that they can do to help their child develop some background knowledge?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of things that parents can do. And one would be to follow your child's interests. I'm not necessarily recommending that in a classroom of 25 or 30. That's not going to be possible probably, but for a parent it is. I mean, if your child is interested in rocks, get some books from the library about rocks, take walks in the park and look for rocks. And what's really crucial here is not reading aloud is crucial, but dialogue, adult child back and forth dialogue, keeping that going, asking and answering why questions, exposing the child to adult vocabulary and enabling the child to use that vocabulary. That's what's going to enable that information to stick in long-term memory and serve that child well in the future. So it doesn't have to be formal, it doesn't mean you have to sit down with your child with a workbook or anything like that. You go to the supermarket and talk about the fruits and the vegetables and where they came from. There are numerous learning opportunities in any ordinary day.
Right. And I agree with that. And I have heard some parents say, that they also struggle with reading. They struggled with reading. They never got the assistance that they needed when they were children. So they still struggle to this day. And they feel like they're doing something wrong by trying to read to their child and they're not maybe doing it the right way, what they perceive as the right way. But I love that you said that dialogue is key, that they really can just talk and have those crucial conversations with their child. That really helps a lot to open that with their children, that dialogue.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, this is Melissa with Kids First Dyslexia Services. I am excited to share with you my private practice. Kids First Dyslexia Services is a private practice that specializes in dyslexia therapy. Each one-on-one session focuses on instruction specific to your child's needs in a nurturing environment that develops self-esteem, builds confidence, and fosters a sense of accomplishment, resulting in happier kids with higher levels of achievement. We provide a professional, personalized experience, always putting the child first. We value the relationships with both our students and parents, because strengthening skills and overcoming hurdles to achieve desired goals and success is a team effort. For more information, please visit www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com. That is www.kidsfirstdyslexia.com.
Hi there. This is Amy Rodenroth, owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services. So tell me if any of these situations are familiar to you. Your dyslexia teacher / therapist has suddenly retired unexpectedly, and you do not have the personnel to fill the space. Or you do not have enough trained teachers or therapists for the number of students who have qualified for dyslexia services, and you need a trained teacher or therapist quickly, like yesterday quickly. Or you need a teacher to provide compensatory services and you do not have anyone that can provide what's needed. Well, what do you do? I'm going to tell you what you can do. You can call Discovery Dyslexia Services. Discovery Dyslexia Services can help you with your various dyslexia concerns. We have multiple CALTs who can provide virtual small group therapy. We can also train your teachers in most dyslexia curricula, either virtually or on site. Just let us know how we can help support you. For more information, go to our website at www.discovereed.com. Let me spell that for you. DYSCOVEREAD.com. And I know it's a funny name, but we're providing huge services for our dyslexic population. So keep in mind, Discovery Dyslexia Services, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show.
I also just kind of piggybacking on that, you had mentioned memory. How does working memory play a role in comprehension?
Well, it's really crucial. And I think working memory is a concept I think that not all teachers are familiar with, but it's been called the most important thing for teachers to understand by one prominent education researcher. So working memory has to do with the way we take in and understand information, or try to. And so it's the aspect of our consciousness where we are trying to understand new information. And the important thing to know about working memory is that it is very limited in its capacity. So on average, it's been found it can hold only about 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed and we start to lose our ability to understand or analyze or retain whatever information we're trying to take in. So that explains why having knowledge stored in long-term memory is so important, because that's the most reliable way around those limitations of working memory. If you have relevant information stored in long-term memory, which is potentially infinite, and you can just withdraw that information from long-term memory when you need it, then you don't have to juggle that bit of information in working memory. And of course, that opens up more capacity in working memory to take in new information, understand it. For example, if you're reading about baseball, I mean, sports makes a great example because there's so much, lingo, jargon, but this applies to really anything that you're reading. And of course, with reading, if you're not yet a proficient reader, then additional burdens on working memory are going to be decoding the words, figuring out where to put the emphasis in the sentence, that kind of thing. But let's say you're reading about a baseball game and you're a baseball fan, so you already know, what a double play is. You don't have to think about that. You don't have to go maybe Google it, which imposes a very heavy burden on working memory. You can just attend to whatever that article is trying to tell you. Whereas I know very little about baseball, I would be looking things up and asking questions, and it would be much harder for me to understand that story.
This kind of goes back to the practice for children when they're trying to develop their reading skills so that new learning can be solidified into their long-term memory.
Right. It is different, though, with those decoding skills, those foundational reading skills, because you can practice phonics patterns and master them and apply that to decode any word. Mm-hmm. But that is what frees up space in working memory. Once those decoding skills become basically automatic, then you have more working memory capacity for understanding, mm-hmm. for comprehension. But with comprehension, practice will not make perfect. I mean, it's whether you can apply a skill like making inferences or whatever, is going to depend to a large extent on your relevant background knowledge.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
So can a teacher build a student's background knowledge? I've said on several of these episodes so far, if I could take my students on a field trip once a month to kind of build some of that natural background knowledge about their environment, I would, but, schools kind of frowned on that. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think because knowledge building is this gradual cumulative process that extends, well, really across a lifetime. I'm still acquiring knowledge, and I'm sure you all are too. So, ideally, you've got in place in a school or a district a coherent, logically sequenced knowledge building curriculum, as I mentioned, so that when kids get to higher grade levels, they will have acquired the knowledge they need at previous grade levels. And so an individual teacher is not going to be able to do that kind of knowledge building because they don't have control over what happens at other grade levels. But that doesn't mean there's nothing they can do. There are definitely things that teachers can do. And I would say, first of all, instead of trying to teach a discrete abstract skill like comparing and contrasting or whatever, start with a topic that you want to teach or a text. It could be a novel, but something meaty, something that you might spend 2 or 3 weeks on. Because kids really, especially with a topic, they need repeated exposure to the same vocabulary, the same concepts in somewhat different contexts over a period of time in order to consolidate that information and really store it in long-term memory. So I would say reading aloud from a set of texts, a text set, like organized around a topic like sea mammals, and maybe start with simpler ones and then, get to more complex ones. And having class discussion, and those texts should generally be more complex than what kids can read themselves, certainly lower grade levels. We know listening comprehension is going to exceed reading comprehension through about age 12, or really until you're a proficient reader. And then along with that, having class discussion that focuses on the content rather than some skill of the week, having kids use that vocabulary they've just heard, that's going to help transfer those concepts and that vocabulary to long-term memory. And then have kids reading about the same topic that they've been learning about through listening and discussion. So rather than just having text organized by reading level, have a basket of books organized by topic, especially if it's a topic you've been learning about through read alouds and discussion, and have those books at different levels of difficulty, because once kids have background knowledge, they may be able to read at a higher level. And then, as I mentioned, I would spend a fair amount of time on social studies and science topics. And again, as I mentioned, they don't all have to be just informational text. You could do a biography of a scientist or stories from history. Kids can get very interested in those if they're presented engagingly. And then lastly, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about this, have kids write about what they are learning rather than just personal narrative or a separate writing curriculum with its own topics, because we know from multiple studies that when kids write about what they're learning, especially if they are explicitly taught how to write and it's done in a manageable way, it's going to boost their learning. It's going to boost their understanding and their retention of information.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, kind of now here's the part B from when we were talking earlier. You talked about background knowledge and baseball, and I saw this wonderful study that you had done about background knowledge and low readers who had knowledge about baseball and readers who were typically high readers but had no knowledge. Could you discuss that with our audience?
Sure. I do want to clarify. I didn't do this study. I'm not a researcher. And this study was done years ago in the late 1980s, but I talk about it a lot, and others do as well. It's come to be known as the baseball study. And it really illustrates the power of background knowledge and its relationship to comprehension. So these researchers, the article came out in 1988. They took a bunch of 7th and 8th graders and divided them into 4 groups, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing a baseball game, half an inning of a baseball game. And then they tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that what really made a difference to the comprehension of the baseball passage was how much a kid knew about baseball. So the poor readers, according to the test, who knew a lot about baseball, did almost as well as the good readers who knew a lot about baseball, and significantly better than the good readers who did not know much about baseball. And I think, and this is not just one study. There have been other studies like that, and it is undisputed. We have lots of evidence that having knowledge of the topic you're reading about really helps with comprehension. But I have to say, early on, after I wrote the book, I was talking about this to somebody who was interviewing me on the radio, and he said, "Oh, yeah, but that's baseball." So I do want to make the point that baseball, as I mentioned, has its own lingo. Sports are like that. Molecular biology is like that. So I think it is most obvious in those kinds of examples where, if you know that specialized lingo, you're going to have an easier time understanding a text on that topic. But what's less obvious but equally important is that we rely on our general background knowledge to understand anything we read. As I said before, the goal is going to be to give students that critical mass of general academic knowledge and vocabulary that's going to enable them to read and understand text on topics they don't already know about. But the only way to get them to that point is by immersing them in lots of specific topics, because vocabulary doesn't stick in the abstract. It needs a meaningful context.
And I can illustrate, I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm thinking about when I work with teachers that are brand new to dyslexia education, things like that, and I give them a text to read and report on. The more we're involved in it, and the more they start to get this understanding, this deeper understanding, the more they're exposed to it, the more background knowledge they form from that. So I totally get that. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I first started, looking into this to education, I didn't really know anything about education. It was a real slog for me to get through an article about cognitive science or education policy. And now I can, kind of zip through because I have more background knowledge.
Yeah, you've been doing this a little while now.
Okay, so I'm super excited to learn about this. What is the Matthew effect in education, and how is it currently playing out across the U.S.?
Yeah, so the Matthew effect, actually, it's a term that's used in the social sciences generally, and basically what it refers to the line in the Gospel of Matthew that basically says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So a growing gap. And in reading, what it can refer to just decoding ability. So the kids with better decoding ability are going to zoom ahead because they're able to read more, and acquire more. If you're just talking in terms of decoding ability, but it's really they're acquiring more knowledge from what they're reading, while the other kids who probably, a lot of kids, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, have both problems with decoding ability and also gaps in background knowledge. They've had less access to the kind of knowledge that's assumed by texts. So those kids fall farther and farther behind their more advantaged peers every year that goes on. There's this growing divergence between the quote unquote good readers and the poor readers. And by the time kids get to higher grade levels, high school, that gap is quite wide and very difficult to narrow. So that explains why we really need to start not only teaching decoding skills early, but also building knowledge and vocabulary largely through read-alouds and discussion in the very early grades, because it's not just about decoding. And we have evidence that when states adopt early literacy policies that are focused, and virtually all states that have done this, and there are 40-some states now that have, they're really focused on foundational skills like dyslexia screening, et cetera. And what happens, these studies have found, is, yes, you do get a boost in test scores in third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. But then after fifth grade, that boost fades out because a couple of reasons. One is that the words become harder to decode. They're more multisyllabic words, and we definitely need to pay attention to that. But the other factor, most likely here, as experts will agree, is that what becomes more important as the grade levels go up, beyond just decoding ability, is comprehension ability. And if kids are not coming to those higher grades with the background knowledge that's assumed by those texts, their achievement is going to decline.
That also brings up something as you talked. I was thinking about a student I had years ago, probably 10, 12 years ago, who came to me for dyslexia therapy. He made progress. It was very slow progress, but he was on the lower end of the socioeconomic status, and he had a lot of issues at home as well. He just struggled to feel safe at home. He struggled to have appropriate food. He felt like his sister was going to hurt him, so he was afraid. There were a lot of things that were more important to him than reading. And it was devastating to me because here I am really working hard at trying to help him because I knew that that was his way out. But yet I still felt so trapped because I knew that there wasn't really much I could do to get past that aspect of it. So I feel like that kind of goes back to Amy and I've talked a lot about relationships with a lot of different speakers that we've had here. I think it kind of goes back to the relationships and really helping build that sense of safety in the classroom as well, to try to help build as much background knowledge as possible, build as much vocabulary as possible in a safe environment. And then when they leave you, hope for the best. Try to give them the most love and attention you can give them while they're there with you.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, obviously, we do need to attend to things like people are experiencing housing insecurity, food insecurity. I mean, it can be devastating for kids. At the same time, I don't think that means that we just abandon our responsibility to actually teach them. Right. And what we need to do is enable kids to feel successful, because that's going to carry over to how they view who they are and what they deserve from life and what they can accomplish in life. And I think that beyond just reading, I think as I've read more and more about cognitive science and its relationship to teaching and learning, I do think that our education system is premised on some ideas that are actually making learning harder for many students and harder for many teachers. And what really works in many cases is a more explicit method of teaching than what we've been doing. And we certainly can have seen that on the phonics end of things, but it applies across the board. You know, what I've seen, for the book, I followed a couple of classrooms that were, one was first grade, one was second grade, and I was comparing. One classroom was using a sort of the standard approach, focusing on comprehension skills. The other was using a knowledge building curriculum. And these two classrooms, these kids they weren't identical, but they were all from low income families, they're less highly educated families. The teachers were both really good teachers, but the kids in the classroom with the knowledge building curriculum felt much more successful. They were very proud of the knowledge that they had. They were eager to answer questions. They're highly engaged in the read alouds and the discussion, whereas the kids in the other classroom, there was nothing for them to grab onto. And I think, it was not the fault of the teacher. I think the teachers are trapped in the system as much as students are. This is a systemic problem. But because of the way the curriculum was set up and because of that teacher's training, those students were constantly being made to feel like failures because, they couldn't remember whether fantasy was fiction or nonfiction, even though they'd been told it was fiction, but they didn't have substance to attach those words to. Whereas, the kids in the other classroom, they had done a unit on American tall tales, Paul Bunyan and all these things that were, Pecos Bill. And I said they were excitedly telling me about all of these one day. And I said, so are these stories true? And they said, oh no, they're exaggerations. So they had gotten a more subtle concept, just not exactly true, not exactly fiction, exaggerations. They could only get to that point because they'd been repeatedly exposed to the concept and they knew a lot of stories that embodied that concept.
And a lot of discussion, probably a lot of class discussion along with that too. That totally supports all of that.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, that is wonderful. So often what we see in schools, I mean, good or bad, teachers will tell students, okay, you can read from this box of books because this is your decoding level, and Johnny can read from this box of books. But we know, working with dyslexic students, typically their decoding levels down here, but their listening comprehension may be up here. How can teachers support students' comprehension when they have a low decoding?
Well, again, and by the way, the tests that are used to assign reading levels to kids, I have read that they are, it's kind of like a coin toss. They're wrong about 50% of the time. So, and it makes sense because those tests are kind of mushing together decoding and comprehension, and they don't take account of the role of background knowledge and comprehension. So if the passage that the kid gets happens to be something he or she knows about, they're going to score higher on that test than if it's a passage on something they know nothing about. But the best way to, especially before kids have become skilled decoders, fluent, decoders, I would not rely on their own reading to build their background knowledge. I would instead, as I've mentioned, we want to do those things orally. And also with writing, we'll get into that in a minute, there's a lot you can do orally to lay the groundwork for later writing, independent writing, and later independent reading. But literacy in its early stages is going to really develop along two separate pathways. And on the one hand, you're going to have kids mastering those decoding skills, reading decodable books, gaining fluency. That's not the way they're going to be expanding their background knowledge in the first instance. The other pathway is those read alouds and discussion, and eventually their decoding skills will catch up to where their background knowledge is. And at that point, that background knowledge will kick in to enable them to read and write about a range of topics at a higher level.
This completes part 1 of our conversation with Natalie Wexler. Join us next week for the riveting conclusion to this interview. The Dyslexia Duo podcast hosts are Amy Rodenroth,
Melissa Dean.
Our producer is Greg Rodenroth.
You can find us on Facebook at The Dyslexia Duo.
Email us any questions or comments at thedyslexiaduo@gmail.com.
Awareness is so important. Share this podcast with your friends,
Family,
and teachers.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.